sudden we were more popular. We had more clout because we understood what that guy did.
He was the voice of the working man, the outlaw who turned prison time into poetry. Merle Haggard didn't just sing about pain, he lived it. For decades, his gravel-drenched voice told stories of heartache, defiance, and redemption. But behind the legend was a man quietly unraveling. Multiple wives, addicted children, a body ravaged by cigarettes and silence. Now, years after his death, the full weight of his life has come into focus, and the tragedy is almost too much to bear. Why did one of country music's greatest icons die so alone, so misunderstood? Before Merle Haggard was a legend, he was a number, A45200. That was his inmate identification at San Quentin State Prison, the maximum security fortress that once held Charles Manson and was home to the final breaths of condemned men. For Haggard, it was both a hell and a womb, the place that broke him and, paradoxically, made him. He was born in Oildale, California, in 1937, the child of Dust Bowl migrants. His father died of a stroke when Merle was just 9 years old. The loss wasn't just emotional, it was economic. His mother, a strict woman of faith, tried to keep him in school and in line, but the absence of his father haunted him. He became restless, rebellious, a thief in training. By the time he was 13, he'd been arrested multiple times. He ran away from home, hitchhiked across the country, slept in boxcars, and stole when he needed to eat. He was smart, too smart for the life he was living, but pain had swallowed up the part of him that might have hoped for more. Then, in 1957, he made the mistake that nearly sealed his fate. At 20 years old, broke and aimless, Merle attempted to rob a Bakersfield roadhouse. It was poorly planned and quickly foiled. He was arrested, charged, and sentenced to prison. Not just jail, San Quentin. Inside, Merle learned how to fight, how to survive, and how to sing without crying. He watched men die. He watched others go insane. But he also watched Johnny Cash, who performed at the prison during Merle's sentence. That concert changed him. Johnny's defiance, his swagger, his honesty. It cracked something open in Merle. He picked up a guitar, started writing, started shaping the chaos of his life into something resembling poetry. He was released in 1960, and he promised himself, no more bars, only stages. But even that promise was half-lie, because the prison never left him. It followed him into every song, every relationship, every quiet moment where he stared too long at a bottle. It shaped him, not just musically, but emotionally. He became a man who never fully trusted freedom, a man who carried guilt like a second skin. When he started recording in the early 60s, the music world didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't polished, he wasn't commercial, but he was real. Songs like Mama Tried and Branded Man weren't stories, they were confessions. Radio stations hesitated, but the people listened. Because in Merle's voice, they heard their own. Fame came quickly. By the mid-1960s, he was a rising star. By 1969, he was a household name, thanks to Okie from Muskogee, a polarizing anthem that made him a cultural lightning rod. To some, he was a right-wing hero. To others, a misunderstood poet. To Merle, he was just a man trying to figure it out. And that was the tragedy. From the very beginning, Merle Haggard was always trying to stay sober, trying to stay married, trying to be better than the boy who once stared through barbed wire and wondered if his life would ever be more than numbers and cement. He made it out, but he never got away. Sing Me Back Home wasn't just another country ballad, it was a plea, quiet, haunting, unforgettable. When Merle Haggard wrote it in 1967, he wasn't imagining a prisoner's final wish. He was remembering one. During his time at San Quentin, Merle witnessed the execution of a fellow inmate named Rabbit. The man had befriended him, shared smokes, joked about the guards. And then, one day, he was marched to the gas chamber. The guards gave Rabbit a last request, a song. Merle, a young prisoner still clinging to his guitar, played quietly as the man was led to die. It wasn't theater, it was survival. In a place where time meant nothing and hope was currency, music was the only thing that felt real. Years later, when Merle was a star, he turned that moment into melody. Sing me back home with a song I used to hear. The song shot to #1 on the country charts and stayed there for weeks. But its success masked its origin. Most listeners didn't know, or didn't care, that it was born in the shadow of death. That was Merle's curse. His pain made him successful, but his success never eased the pain. As he climbed the charts, Merle was also climbing deeper into himself. He didn't trust the industry. He didn't trust the politics swirling around him. He didn't even trust love. He married 5 times. Each woman thought she'd be the one to tame him. Each left with scars. Bonnie Owens, his second wife, stuck around the longest. Even after their divorce, she continued touring with him. She understood him better than anyone. But even she admitted, Merle's soul isn't something you can fix. Only respect. By the early 1970s, Haggard was both a star and a warning. He sang of hard work, hard time, and hard women. Songs like Workin' Man Blues and The Bottle Let Me Down weren't fiction. They were documentation. The more he revealed himself, the more the world consumed him. Critics loved his authenticity, but they didn't see the breakdowns backstage, the long silences, the drinking that never stopped, only slowed. The nights when Merle would disappear after a show, driving into the desert alone, not telling anyone where he was going. Friends said he had ghosts, not just Rabbit, not just the men left behind in prison, but himself, the version of him that never really believed he deserved this life. Even at the height of his fame, Merle remained deeply insecure. He once confessed to a journalist that every time he stepped on stage, he felt like he was conning people. Like they're clapping for someone I'm pretending to be. That admission, raw, unguarded, was never published in full. The editor cut it, said it was too sad. But that was the truth about Merle Haggard. His music healed others, but it never healed him. And as the decades wore on, that gap between what he gave and what he had left only grew wider. The title Outlaw Country wasn't just marketing. It was identity, a badge of rebellion worn by a select few: Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Merle Haggard, the quietest of the 4, but perhaps the most authentic. Unlike the others, Merle didn't posture. He didn't wear black like armor, or grow his hair to prove a point. His outlaw status was earned the hard way, through cells, scars, and songs that didn't ask for sympathy. He wore it like a scar, visible, but never romanticized. In the 1970s, outlaw country exploded. Fans rejected the polished Nashville sound. They wanted grit, reality, soul, and Merle delivered. His records didn't feel like studio projects. They felt like confessions. But even as he ascended to royalty in the outlaw kingdom, Merle began to feel trapped again. Success had rules, expectations. He was expected to be the rebel, the voice of blue-collar America, the man who told the truth and never sold out. And yet, behind the scenes, he was breaking down. The demands of fame clashed violently with his trauma. He hated interviews, hated cameras, hated pretending. He took solace in touring, not because he loved the stage, but because the movement kept him from thinking too long. But even that began to crack. The alcohol, always present, became a crutch. The pills followed. Then the isolation. His bandmates described a man drifting from them even as they played behind him. Some nights, one said, he'd sing like an angel. Other nights, you couldn't reach him. The industry called him a genius, but Merle didn't see it. He felt like a fraud. He started missing cues, canceling shows, lashing out at journalists who asked about his past. At one point, he tried to walk away, bought a ranch, said he'd retire. But the silence was worse than the noise. By the late 80s, his personal life was in shambles. His kids barely knew him. His marriages were crumbling. His money, poorly managed, was vanishing. And yet, he kept recording, kept singing, because music was all he had left. He sang not for joy, but for survival. And that, more than anything, was the heartbreak of Merle Haggard. He gave us everything. But it cost him everything. For all of Merle Haggard's rugged outlaw persona, the whiskey-soaked ballads, the prison yard cred, the steely defiance, there was always a woman nearby. Often more than one, but one stood out above the rest. Bonnie Owens. The woman who stayed long after the marriage ended. The woman who understood him when he barely understood himself. Bonnie Owens wasn't just a singer or a supportive spouse. She was his emotional backbone during his most explosive and unstable years. When Merle first met her in the early 1960s, she was the ex-wife of Buck Owens and already an accomplished performer. She could have gone her own way. Instead, she joined him on stage, in the studio, and in life. She helped Merle shape his voice, not his literal singing, but his identity. She coached him through interviews, protected him from his own worst impulses, and stood on stage every night, blending her voice into his pain. Together, they were luminous. But the tragedy wasn't their divorce. It was what came after. When they split in 1978, Bonnie didn't vanish like most ex-wives of famous men. She stayed, kept touring with him, kept singing harmonies, kept holding the emotional reins when he stumbled. Because Bonnie knew what no one else seemed to. Merle was brilliant, but broken. And that brokenness was seductive. Not in the romantic sense, but in the way that people try to fix what they didn't break. Bonnie never said it aloud, but those close to her could see it. She stayed because she feared what he would become without her, and she was right to worry. After Bonnie stepped back, emotionally, if not professionally, Merle spiraled into a series of chaotic relationships. His third marriage to Leona Williams, also a country singer, was passionate but stormy. They fought constantly. She once described living with him as walking through a thunderstorm with a lit cigarette. He married again, and again, 5 times in total. Each new wife entered the story with hope that maybe she would be the one to bring stability. None succeeded. Merle's emotional wounds ran too deep, and he lacked the tools to face them. Instead, he poured himself into alcohol and amphetamines. Not in wild binges like other rock stars, but in slow, steady doses, just enough to mute the ache. His songs reflected it. Tracks like Misery and Gin, My Own Kind of Hat, and The Way I Am weren't just musings. They were therapy sessions without a therapist, and in every one, a shadow of Bonnie remained. Even in his later years, Merle would talk about Bonnie with a wistful smile. "She saved my life more times than I can count," he once said, "and I ruined hers more than I should have." That sentence haunted fans and family alike. It was one of the few moments where Merle allowed vulnerability to eclipse pride. When Bonnie died in 2006, Merle was devastated. He didn't appear at public memorials. He didn't release a statement. He went silent. For days, maybe longer. He didn't just lose an ex-wife, a friend said. He lost his mirror. Without Bonnie, the last thread of emotional tethering snapped, and Merle, already withdrawn, retreated further. The woman behind the whiskey had finally let go, and Merle, for all his grit and grit-filled songs, never really recovered. Merle Haggard's studio sessions in the 1970s and 80s were legendary, not just for the music, but for the atmosphere. Cigarette smoke clouded the ceilings. Empty whiskey bottles lined the console, and always, Merle stood in the middle, half present, half elsewhere. He was productive, incredibly so. Some years, he recorded 4 albums, but the drive wasn't creative energy. It was compulsion, escape. The studio was the only place he felt in control, even when he wasn't. By the mid-1980s, Merle was addicted to amphetamines, alcohol, and sleeping pills. He masked it well. Outlaw country icons weren't supposed to be sober, but there were signs. Producers reported erratic behavior, sometimes brilliant, other times incomprehensible. He'd vanish between takes, argue with bandmates over minute details. Once, he walked out mid-session, drove for 4 hours, and returned without explanation. No one asked where he'd gone. The drugs were about pace, keeping up with a schedule, outrunning the emptiness. But the alcohol? That was something deeper. At home, Merle was a ghost. His children, of which he had 6, have described a man both generous and absent. He provided houses, cars, tuition, but emotionally, he was a locked door. He'd emerge from his room at odd hours, sometimes cheerful, sometimes withdrawn. He rarely played with them, rarely asked questions, rarely said, "I love you." Ben Haggard, his youngest, has spoken publicly about his father's contradictions. "He was my hero," Ben said, "but I didn't really know him." That distance wasn't cruelty. It was fear. Fear of getting too close, of being seen, of being loved and failing anyway. Some of Merle's darkest songs came from this period. Footlights, Going Where the Lonely Go. That's the way love goes. They weren't hits, but they were raw. Fans didn't always connect, but fellow musicians knew what they meant. He was unraveling. The industry didn't intervene. No rehab was publicly suggested. No manager staged an intervention. This was country music, after all. Pain was part of the package. But behind closed doors, Merle was disappearing. He stopped answering calls, stopped attending family events. On holidays, he'd often sit alone in his music room, drinking, watching old westerns, or scribbling lyrics he never recorded. His band knew better than to ask questions. When he was ready to play, they played. When he wasn't, they waited. Years later, a former session musician said, "Merle didn't need anyone, and that's exactly why he was in so much pain." The addiction faded as he aged. His body couldn't handle it. But the silence remained. Even as he sobered up, he stayed distant, from fans, from family, from himself. The tragedy wasn't that he died addicted. The tragedy was that even sober, he remained alone. Merle Haggard was a father to 6 children, and a father figure to millions of fans. But like so many men of his generation, he struggled to give love in any way that resembled softness. He gave them gifts. He gave them music. He gave them his name, but he didn't give them himself. Ben, Marty, Dana, Noel, Janessa, and Kelly each inherited a different version of Merle. Some got the genius. Some got the absentee. Some got a father trying, late in life, to right old wrongs. Marty, perhaps the most publicly successful, became a country singer in his own right. But their relationship was fraught. At one point, Marty walked away from the industry altogether, focusing on Christian ministry. He cited the darkness of fame and family trauma as reasons. He was a great artist, Marty once said, but he was a hard man to love. Noel followed a similar path, dabbling in music, but always walking in his father's shadow. People expected me to be him, Noel said, but I didn't even know him. Ben, the youngest, had the most consistent contact with Merle in later years. He toured with him, played guitar beside him, became his caretaker in some ways. Their bond was musical, not emotional, but it was something. Still, even Ben admits, he wasn't a dad in the traditional sense, but he showed love the only way he could, through music. For the daughters, the story is more elusive. Janessa and Kelly stayed out of the spotlight. They rarely gave interviews, rarely attended events. Rumors swirled of estrangement, of resentment, but nothing was confirmed. What is confirmed is this: Merle left behind more than a legacy. He left behind silence, unanswered questions, emotional debts that music could never repay. In his will, he left assets, properties, royalties, but his most lasting inheritance was his absence. The spaces where love should have been, filled instead with lyrics and distance. Some families heal in death. Merle's didn't. After he passed, the children issued individual statements. Not a united front, but fractured voices. They loved him. They missed him. But they never claimed to fully understand him. And maybe that's the final heartbreak, that a man who gave the world so much truth could never fully speak it to his own children. It happened on stage, in Fresno, California, March 2016. Merle Haggard had battled pneumonia on and off for months. At 78, his body was thinning, his lungs weakening, but he insisted on performing. He'd canceled shows already that year and hated letting fans down. "If I'm breathing," he told his manager, "I'm singing." The venue was packed. Fans of all ages, many who'd grown up with his voice, filled the auditorium. He walked slowly to the mic, aided by his son Ben and longtime bandmate Norm Hamlet. No flash, no fanfare, just the man, the guitar, and the weight of a lifetime. The band started in on Silver Wings, a simple ballad, one Merle had sung thousands of times. But this time, something shifted. His voice cracked, not from emotion, from age, from illness. The notes didn't come out clean. The grit had become gravel. The smooth melancholy was now a struggle. His hand shook slightly on the guitar neck. The breath between lines grew longer. When the song ended, there was no smile, just a nod. The crowd clapped politely. Many didn't notice, or pretended not to. But Merle noticed. He turned to Ben and whispered something. Ben shook his head. Then Merle spoke into the mic. "Folks, I'm sorry. I don't think I can give you what you paid for tonight." Some cheered anyway. Others stood silently. And then he left the stage. It would be his last full performance. That moment, quiet, unsensational, deeply human, marked the true end of an era. Not because he quit, but because he couldn't fight it anymore. In the weeks that followed, he checked into a hospital again. This time, the diagnosis was grim. Double pneumonia, chronic bronchitis, and signs of pulmonary fibrosis. Doctors advised complete rest. No travel, no stress, no singing. Merle agreed, reluctantly. At home, he was subdued. Friends say he barely spoke. He didn't want to be seen, didn't want sympathy, didn't want people remembering him as sick. He asked his family not to post any photos. "Let them remember me from Bakersfield," he told Ben, "not from a damn hospital bed." But the illness advanced quickly. By mid-March, he was on oxygen full-time. He slept most days. At night, he'd sit up briefly and scribble lyrics. His handwriting had become shaky, sometimes illegible. But the ideas were still there. Lines like, "Time waits for no outlaw, it just shoots and rides away." He wanted to record one last song. He never got the chance. On April 6, 2016, his 79th birthday, Merle Haggard died at home in Palo Cedro, California, surrounded by family. It was quiet, peaceful, and devastating. The news hit hard. Fans flooded social media. Radio stations played marathon tributes. Country stars lined up to honor him, from Willie Nelson to Eric Church. But beneath the praise was a sobering truth. Merle didn't get the send-off he deserved. There was no state funeral, no major televised tribute, no Grammy segment long enough. Just a quiet exit, as if the world wasn't quite ready to face what it had lost. But maybe that's how he wanted it. A man who spent his life resisting spectacle, slipping out the side door one last time. Long before his final days, Merle Haggard had already begun disappearing. He'd moved to Palo Cedro, a small town northeast of Redding, far from the spotlight, far from Nashville. But spiritually, his real home was always Bakersfield. Not the city itself, but the sound, the edge, the rebellion. He and Buck Owens defined that sound in the 1960s. Twangy guitars, hard drums, lyrics like open wounds. Bakersfield was blue-collar, beer-stained, and brutally honest. And so was Merle. But as country music changed, Bakersfield was left behind. So was he. By the 2000s, Haggard's relationship with the industry had soured. He felt ignored, even as younger artists borrowed from his playbook. He watched pop country dominate the airwaves, slick, polished, apolitical. He called it karaoke with money. The anger became isolation. He stopped attending awards shows, declined interviews, refused to chase trends. He recorded albums on his terms, sparse, soulful, largely unnoticed. Critics praised them. The public barely noticed. He took solace in his ranch. Horses, quiet mornings, and a handful of close friends. He built a small studio, but used it less and less. "I got more silence in me now," he said once, "than songs." Fans still wrote letters, thousands of them. He read them, but rarely replied. Sometimes he'd hum a line inspired by a letter, but he never sent thanks. It wasn't rudeness, it was retreat. Even when he played live, the venues shrank. Casinos, fairs, small theaters, the energy was gone. The voice still hit its marks, but the fire was fading. His eyes rarely lit up. And backstage, he was often alone. After the shows, he'd go straight to the bus, read a paperback, drink tea or whiskey, depending on the night. Some nights he'd talk with Ben about chords. Other nights, he'd just sit in silence. He wasn't lonely, Ben said, but he was alone. There's a difference. And it defined Merle's final decade. Bakersfield, the city that once made him, tried to honor him. A statue, a street name, a museum exhibit. But Merle didn't attend the dedications, didn't cut ribbons. He just nodded from afar. He didn't want celebration. He wanted to be left alone. And in the end, that's what he got. But it came with a heavy cost. Isolation wasn't just a choice, it was a sentence. And for the man who once sang the soul of a nation, it was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. In early 2016, Merle Haggard's team quietly began booking what they feared would be his final tour. They didn't market it as such. That would have been too cruel, too final. But internally, everyone knew. His health was slipping. His stamina was low. But the legend himself insisted, "Let me go out playing." The idea was to do a dozen dates, short sets, controlled environments. His son Ben would support him on guitar. Longtime bandmates would handle the heavy lifting. But by the second show, it was clear. Merle wasn't up for it. He struggled to breathe during sound check, had to sit between songs. His memory, once steel-trap sharp, wavered. On one night in Las Vegas, he forgot the words to "Today I Started Loving You Again," a song he'd written with Bonnie Owens and performed for 40 years. Still, he pressed on. Fans were gracious. They knew they were watching a man give everything he had left. Some cried. Some stood silently, hats over their hearts. They weren't cheering a performance. They were mourning a man in real time. But behind the scenes, it was chaos. His manager begged him to rest. His doctor issued a warning. Another tour date could kill him. Ben tried to cancel shows quietly, but Merle would push back. "I'll die on stage before I die in a bed," he said. It wasn't bravado. It was terror. Merle feared what would happen if he stopped moving, if he stayed home too long, if the silence swallowed him. So he kept going, until the show in Fresno, when his body finally said no. After that, the rest of the tour was scrapped. Refunds were issued. Some fans were upset. Most understood. But Merle never made it to another stage, and those who loved him most were left with a question that still haunts them. Should they have stopped him sooner? When Merle Haggard died on April 6, 2016, his 79th birthday, America lost more than a country music legend. We lost a truth-teller, a contradiction, a wounded prophet in a cowboy hat. His death didn't make headlines for long. That week, the news was dominated by political primaries, celebrity scandals, and sports. There was no national day of mourning, no flag at half-mast. But for millions of people, truck drivers, factory workers, single moms, ex-cons, it felt like a family member had gone. Because Merle didn't just sing songs, he sang them. His death exposed something quietly devastating: how disposable true art has become. He'd sold over 75 million records, inspired every major country artist, and transformed the genre. But in the end, he died in a modest house, surrounded by family, largely forgotten by the industry he helped build. And perhaps that's the saddest part, that a man who gave so much and endured so much was never fully celebrated in life. Not like Johnny, not like Willie. His politics were too murky, his past too real, his sadness too sharp. He was too complex to canonize. But that's what made him matter. Merle Haggard didn't offer comfort. He offered confrontation with your past, your country, your choices, yourself. And now that he's gone, we're left with questions. Who sings for the working man now? Who dares write songs that offend, that confess, that bleed? Who tells the truth? The answer may be no one. And maybe that's why the tragedy of Merle Haggard isn't just how he died, but that he might be the last of his kind. Merle Haggard sang of prisons, heartbreak, and hard-won truths. But behind the music was a man forever haunted by his own demons. His tragedy wasn't in dying. It was in how little we truly saw him while he was alive. Don't let his voice fade into history. Let it haunt the silence we leave behind. Subscribe for more forgotten stories, lost legends, and the truths fame tried to bury.